Get on the ground. Right now.
Officer Merritt said.
You people really thought you could just, have your little party?
He laughed.
One opportunity, Lieutenant. Please take your officers and leave my wedding.
Eleanor said deliberately.
Lady, I don't care who you think you are.
He leaned in.
You're nobody. You hear me? Get her in cuffs!
The whole garden went silent. The guests watched an officer force a bride's arms behind her back while her groom lay face down in the grass. What Officer Chad Merritt didn't know was that he had just handcuffed a United States federal judge on her wedding day, the very woman who would decide his future. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The mirror didn't lie. Eleanor Harshman stood in the bridal suite of Magnolia Grove Estate and stared at the woman looking back at her. Ivory silk, pearl earrings, a veil so white it almost hurt to look at. She had stood in courtrooms for 11 years without flinching. She had faced down defense attorneys, prosecutors, and men twice her age who thought a young black woman had no business holding a gavel. She had never once let them see her sweat. But right now, her hands were shaking. "Hold still," Ross said. Her sister's fingers worked carefully at the back of the veil, pinning it exactly right. Rosalind Harshman was 45, 10 years older than Eleanor, and she had been fixing things for Eleanor since their mother died. Shoelaces, broken friendships, a heart that needed mending after a divorce that nearly broke her. Today, it was a veil. Ross treated it like the most important job she had ever done. Maybe it was. "You're fidgeting," Ross said, not looking up. "I'm not fidgeting. Your left hand is shaking." Eleanor pressed her hand flat against her thigh. The silk was cool under her palm. She breathed in slowly, the way she always did before walking into a hard courtroom, and let it out even slower. From across the suite, the sound of laughter broke through her thoughts. Her bridesmaids, a federal prosecutor, a sitting congresswoman, and a woman who had clerked for the Supreme Court, were passing around a champagne bottle and arguing about the music choices for the reception. 3 of the most powerful women Eleanor had ever known, and right now they were bickering like teenagers at a slumber party. She loved them for it. She turned back to the mirror. For one quiet moment, she let herself just look. Not at the judge, not at the title or the robe or the 11 years of rulings, just the woman, 38 years old, finally, completely, stupidly happy. Then the memory came, the way it always did when things got too good. She was 7 years old, a Sunday morning. Her father had been wearing his best suit, dark blue, pressed sharp, and he had been walking with her down a sidewalk 2 blocks from their church. A police officer had stepped in front of them. Not because of anything her father did, not because of anything at all, except who her father was and what he looked like. "Get off the sidewalk. Walk in the street where you belong." Her father had complied. He always complied. His jaw had tightened. She remembered that, the small muscle jumping near his ear. But he stepped off the curb without a word and took her hand and walked the rest of the way in the street like the officer told him to. That night, Eleanor had asked him why. He had sat on the edge of her bed for a long time before he answered. His voice had been soft and certain. "Because today I can't win, baby. But one day you will." He died before he got to see her sworn in. "Hey." Ross's hand came down on Eleanor's shoulder, gentle and firm at the same time. "Don't you dare cry. I just did your makeup." Eleanor laughed. It came out a little watery, But it was real. "I'm not crying." "Your eyes are lying," Ross said, but she was smiling when she said it. She stepped around to face Eleanor and held her by both shoulders and looked at her the way only an older sister can, like she was seeing every version of her at once. The 7-year-old, the law student surviving on coffee and determination, the young judge who walked into her first courtroom and refused to be small. "Mama would have loved this dress," Ross said. Eleanor nodded. She didn't trust her voice for a second. Outside, through the tall windows of the bridal suite, she could see the garden. 140 chairs arranged in perfect rows beneath Georgia magnolia trees, white roses on every aisle post, the afternoon light coming down warm and golden through the leaves. And at the far end of the aisle, at a wooden altar draped in white, stood Mackie Wilbert. Even from a distance, she could see his hands clasped in front of him. She could see him shift his weight, just slightly, the way he always did when he was trying to hold himself together. She knew exactly how he felt. The string quartet began to play. "Ready?" Ross asked. Eleanor looked at her father's face in her mind one last time. "One day, baby. You will." "Yeah," she said. "I'm ready." She stepped out of the suite and started walking. She was 40 feet from Mackie when the sirens hit. Not one, not two. 6 police cruisers tore up the venue's private drive like the place was on fire, tires grinding the gravel, lights slashing red and blue across the white chairs, and the flower arrangements, and the faces of 140 people who had come here to celebrate love. Eleanor stopped walking. For 1/2 second, nobody moved. The string quartet went silent, mid-note. The flower girl, Mackie's niece, 6 years old in a yellow dress, froze in the middle of the aisle with her basket clutched to her chest. Then the gates burst open. 12 officers in tactical gear poured into the garden with their hands on their weapons, and the world Eleanor had been standing in 30 seconds ago simply ceased to exist. "Nobody move! This is a lawful search! Stay where you are!" The screaming started. Elderly guests lurched out of their chairs. A woman near the back fainted into her husband's arms. The flower girl dropped her basket and started crying, petals scattering everywhere, and nobody picked them up because everyone was too busy trying to understand what was happening. Lieutenant Chad Merritt came through the gate last. He walked like a man who owned every room he entered. Pressed uniform, hard jaw. A search warrant held up in one hand like it was a trophy. He scanned the garden once. Quick, dismissive, and then his voice cut across everything. "We have a credible report of illegal firearms and narcotics trafficking on this property. Everyone will remain calm and comply with all instructions. This is a wedding." Mackie. He had stepped away from the altar, both hands raised, his voice caught somewhere between outrage and pure disbelief. He was still wearing his boutonniere, a white gardenia already starting to wilt in the Georgia heat. 2 officers moved on him immediately. "Sir, get on the ground." "I am not getting on the—" They didn't wait for him to finish. They grabbed him by both arms and forced him down onto the grass, face first, in his tuxedo, in front of his family and his friends and the woman he was supposed to marry in the next 60 seconds. Eleanor's breath left her body. The groomsmen were next. 4 black men in tuxedos, ordered down into the grass with weapons trained on them like they were dangerous. Like the pocket squares and the shined shoes, and the joy on their faces meant absolutely nothing. One of them, Mackie's college roommate, a man who taught middle school science, was shaking so hard his hands rattled against the ground. "Get your hands off me. I am a member of the United States Congress. That was Della Foster, Congresswoman, Eleanor's bridesmaid, 5'4" and absolutely terrifying when angry. An officer grabbed her by the arm and turned her physically away from the scene. She didn't stop talking. Nobody listened. Ross came out of nowhere. She had followed Eleanor out of the suite, still holding the champagne glass, and when she saw Mackie on the ground and the officer's hand on Eleanor's arm, she moved like a woman, 20 years younger. "Get your hands off my sister!" An officer stepped directly into her path with one hand out. The force of it sent Ross stumbling backward. The champagne glass hit the ground and shattered. She grabbed at the officer's arm to keep her balance, and he shoved her back harder. And Eleanor watched her sister's elbow connect with one of the white chairs and heard her sharp cry of pain. Something cold and absolute settled into Eleanor's chest. Merritt was in front of her now. Up close, he was younger than she expected, late 30s, sandy-haired, with the particular kind of smirk that some men get when they feel completely untouchable. He looked her up and down, the gown, the veil, the pearl earrings, and his expression didn't change even slightly. She was not a person to him. She was an inconvenience in a white dress. "Ma'am, I need you on the ground." Eleanor did not move. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She looked at Chad Merritt with eyes that had stared down career criminals and corrupt attorneys and men who thought they could intimidate her into smaller decisions, and she said, very quietly and very clearly, "Lieutenant, I need you to think very carefully about what you do next." Merritt looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he smiled. "Lady," he said, "I don't care if you're the Queen of England. Get down." Merritt didn't even blink. "Last warning," he said. "On the ground, or you're in cuffs. Your choice." Eleanor still didn't move. She stood in her ivory gown with her hands at her sides and looked at him like he was a problem she had already solved. Around them, the garden had become something unrecognizable. Guests were pressed together in frightened clusters. An older man in a gray suit was trying to help his wife stay calm while she wept into his shoulder. The groomsmen were still face down on the grass. Mackie hadn't moved from where they'd forced him down. He kept trying to turn his head to find Eleanor, and every time he did, an officer barked at him to stay still. Nobody was looking at Merritt's junior officer. His name was Tyler Watts, 23 years old, 31 days on the job. He had been standing near the garden gate trying to look useful, and for the first few minutes he had managed it. Kept his face neutral, kept his hand near his belt, acted like he knew exactly why 12 officers had just destroyed a wedding on a Saturday afternoon in Atlanta. But then he had recognized Della Foster. He had seen her on the news enough times to know her face. Congresswoman, House Judiciary Committee, and she wasn't the only one. The woman next to her, the one who had been a bridesmaid, Tyler had seen her picture in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution 2 months ago. Federal prosecutor. The woman beside her had argued before the Supreme Court. Tyler looked around the garden slowly. Really looked. These were not ordinary guests. He moved quietly, pulled out his phone, typed fast, thumbs stumbling a little, searched the name he had heard an officer read off the warrant paperwork when they were briefing 40 minutes ago. Mackie Wilbert, Associated Party, Eleanor Harshman. He hit search. The result came up in 2 seconds. The photo was professional, official. A black woman in judicial robes, seated behind a bench, her expression calm and precise and completely certain of itself. The caption below read, "The Honorable Eleanor Harshman Wilbert, U.S. Federal District Court Judge, Eastern District of Georgia. Appointed 2009. Reconfirmed 2017. Tyler looked at the photo. Then he looked at the woman in the wedding dress 15 feet away. Same cheekbones, same eyes. Same absolute stillness in the face of pressure. His stomach dropped straight through the ground. He crossed the garden in 8 steps and grabbed Merritt by the sleeve. "Lieutenant?" His voice came out lower than he intended. "Sir, I need you to see something." Merritt turned with the expression of a man who did not enjoy being interrupted. Tyler held out the phone anyway. Merritt looked at the screen. The garden seemed to get quieter, though nothing had actually changed. Merritt's jaw stopped moving. The smirk, the permanent, untouchable smirk, flickered. Just for a second. Just enough to show that something underneath it was not as solid as it looked. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the phone. He looked at Eleanor again. Around them, officers were starting to notice. The body language shift moved through the group the way a cold wind moves through tall grass. One, then the next, then the next. Someone holstered their weapon. Someone else took a quiet step back. Eleanor had watched all of it. Every second. She hadn't moved a muscle, but her eyes had tracked Merritt's face with the patience of someone who had waited out much harder moments than this one. Now she tilted her head, just 1 degree, and when she spoke, her voice was so calm it was almost gentle. "I'm going to give you one opportunity," she said. "Stand down this operation. Release every person on this property. Take your officers and leave my wedding." She paused. "One opportunity, Lieutenant. I'd take it." The whole garden was watching now. Even the crying had stopped. Even the elderly man with his arm around his wife had gone still. 140 people held their breath. Merritt stood there for a long moment with the phone in his hand, and the truth of what he had walked into laid out right in front of him. He handed the phone back to Tyler. He straightened his uniform. And then Chad Merritt made the worst decision of his life. "The warrant is legal," he said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "The search proceeds." He looked directly at Eleanor. "Cuff her." The phones came out across the entire garden. Every guest, all at once, every camera aimed and recording. Officers had stopped trying to take them. There were simply too many. Nobody was going to unsee this. Eleanor said nothing as they pulled her arms behind her back. She said nothing as the cuffs clicked into place. She said nothing as Merritt walked her toward the police vehicle, her veil tilted sideways, her gown dragging across the trampled grass. She didn't need to say anything. 140 witnesses were saying it for her. The door closed. Eleanor sat in the back of the police cruiser and listened to it click shut. And then there was nothing but the sound of her own breathing and the muffled chaos outside the window. Through the glass, she could see the garden, the overturned chairs, the officers moving through the rows of guests like they owned the place. Ross standing at the perimeter with her arms crossed and tears running down her face. Not the soft kind of tears, the furious kind. Mackie was in a separate vehicle. She couldn't see him from here. She closed her eyes. Most people, in handcuffs, in the back of a police car on their wedding day, in a dress that cost more than their first car. Most people would fall apart. Eleanor understood that. She had sat on the bench long enough to know exactly what fear and helplessness felt like when they hit a person at the same time. But Eleanor Harshman had a rule she had followed since her first year on the bench. When everything is on fire, think. So, she thought. She thought about the warrant, thought about the timestamp Dwayne had spotted. Approved in under 4 hours. She thought about Merritt's face when he looked at that phone screen, and the half-second of panic before the arrogance slammed back down like a steel door. She thought about the camera phones, 140 of them, all recording, all uploading to places Chad Merritt could not touch. She opened her eyes. "Excuse me," she said. The officer in the front seat glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Young, maybe 25. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I'd like to make one phone call," Eleanor said. "You're not required to allow it, but I'm asking." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked away. Then he reached forward, unlocked his personal cell phone, and held it toward her. "What's the number?" he said quietly. She gave it to him. He dialed, then held the phone up to her ear, and kept it there without being asked. It rang once. O'Hara. Piper O'Hara's voice was exactly what Eleanor needed to hear. Calm and sharp at the same time, like a blade wrapped in good manners. Eleanor had hired her as a law clerk 9 years ago and watched her become one of the most capable federal officers she had ever known. "Piper," Eleanor said. "They raided the wedding. Fake tip. Mackie is in custody. I'm in a vehicle on the property now." 1 second of silence. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Is Mackie hurt?" "I don't believe so." "Who authorized the warrant?" "I don't know yet. It was expedited. Under 4 hours." Another silence. Shorter this time. "I'm already moving," Piper said. The call lasted 45 seconds. The officer lowered the phone. He didn't look at her. He set it back on the front seat and stared straight ahead through the windshield. And Eleanor noticed that his hands were gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary for a vehicle that wasn't moving. She settled back against the seat and turned her face to the window and let herself have exactly 10 seconds of something that wasn't anger and wasn't grief and wasn't fear. It was just the weight of the day pressing down on her all at once. The flowers, the quartet, Mackie at the altar with his eyes full of everything he wanted to say. 10 seconds. Then she put it away. Outside, at the far edge of the property, her brother was already working. Dwayne Brixton had been a cop for 8 years before he quit and opened the nonprofit. He still thought like one. When the officers had swept through the garden collecting people, Dwayne had done the thing he learned in his second week on the force. Stay calm, speak clearly. Identify yourself before they have a reason to decide for you. He had his old badge in his wallet out of habit. He showed it, gave his name, stated his connection to the property. The officer waved him to the perimeter and moved on to someone easier to deal with. Dwayne had been standing at that perimeter ever since, watching everything. He had a good eye. Always had. And what his eye had caught, during the 30 seconds Merritt was waving the warrant paperwork around before the search began, was the filing timestamp on the top right corner of the document. Under 4 hours, start to finish. That wasn't procedure. That was pull. Someone inside that department had pushed this warrant through so fast the ink was barely dry. And that meant someone inside that department had something to gain from it. Dwayne got on his phone. He worked through 3 contacts before he reached the right one. A retired desk sergeant named Alonzo, who had 30 years of institutional memory and no particular loyalty to people who did dirty work. Alonzo called back in 12 minutes. The text was short. Just a company name and a person. The shell company's registered agent, Victor Stanhope. Dwayne stared at the screen. He knew that name. Everyone in Atlanta knew that name. Old money. Real estate. 3 times Eleanor had ruled against Stanhope's development projects from the bench. 3 times Stanhope had walked out of her courtroom looking like a man who didn't forget things. Dwayne looked up from the phone, looked at the cruiser holding his sister. His jaw tightened, the same way their fathers had, all those years ago on a Sunday sidewalk. He started making another call. They left without saying a word. No explanation, no apology. Not even the basic decency of eye contact. The officers filed back through the garden gate the same way they came in, except this time their weapons were holstered, and their warrant had produced absolutely nothing, because there was nothing to find. Merritt was the last one out. He walked past Eleanor like she was a lamppost, like she was nothing, like the last 2 hours had been a minor inconvenience he was already forgetting. The gate swung shut behind him. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Mackie crossed the garden in 6 long strides and pulled Eleanor into his arms, and she let him. And the 2 of them stood in the middle of what was supposed to be the best day of their lives, and held on to each other while the wreckage settled around them. It was bad. The white chairs were scattered and overturned across the grass. The flower arrangements had been knocked from their posts, petals ground into the dirt under boot heels. The reception table near the garden wall had been upended during the search. Dishes shattered, glasses broken. The 3-tier wedding cake destroyed completely, lying in pieces across the flagstone like something that had fallen from a great height. 2 elderly guests, a couple in their 70s, who had driven 4 hours from Savannah, were being attended to by a paramedic near the gate. The woman had gone faint during the commotion. Her husband hadn't let go of her hand since. Ross stood near the altar with her arms wrapped around herself. There was a bruise already forming on her forearm, dark against her skin, where the officer had shoved her into the chair. She was staring at the destroyed cake like she was deciding something. "You okay?" Eleanor asked her. Ross looked up. Her eyes were dry now, past the crying stage and into something colder. "No," she said simply. "Are you?" Eleanor looked around the garden. 11 years on the federal bench. 38 years of building something from nothing, of fighting for every inch, of refusing to be made small. And they had walked in here on her wedding day, her one day, and done this. "Not even a little," Eleanor said. By evening, the footage was everywhere. Eleanor watched it from the couch at home, still in her wedding dress, because she hadn't been able to make herself change yet. Her phone had been ringing since 3 o'clock, and she had stopped answering it an hour ago. On the television, the clip played on a loop. Eleanor in ivory silk, hands cuffed behind her back, being walked across a trampled garden while 100 camera phones tracked every step. Cable networks had picked it up within the hour. By dinner time, it had 30 million views. Mackie sat beside her. Dwayne sat across from them. Ross had made coffee that nobody was drinking. Then the press conference started. Chief Raymond Parlin filled the screen. 55 years old, silver-haired, built like a man who had spent decades making himself look trustworthy. He stood behind a podium with 3 flags behind him and the kind of expression that said he had already decided how this was going to go. He called the raid procedurally sound. He said the tip had been credible and serious. He said his officers had acted with professionalism and restraint. And then he looked directly into the camera and said, "No one in this city is above the law, not even federal judges." The room went absolutely silent. Ross set down her coffee cup very carefully, like she didn't trust what she might do if she was holding something. Eleanor didn't react. She just watched Parlin's face on the screen, the practiced sincerity of it, the complete absence of shame. And then she reached over and turned the television off. "Dwayne," she said, "show them." Dwayne pulled out his phone and laid everything out on the coffee table. The warrant timestamp, Alonzo's text, the shell company registration, Victor Stanhope's name at the bottom of all of it. He walked them through the connection between Stanhope's real estate network and the corridor where Magnolia Grove Estate sat. 4.2 acres that Stanhope had been circling for 2 years. Mackie leaned forward, reading. His expression moved through disbelief and into something harder. Ross just stared at the name. Victor Stanhope. Eleanor stood up from the couch. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark street for a long moment. When she turned around, something had changed in her face. The grief was gone. The shock was gone. What was left was something focused and immovable, like a door being locked from the inside. "I've spent 30 years giving everyone their day in court," she said quietly. Nobody spoke. "I think it's time I took mine." The next morning came gray and quiet. Eleanor was already at the kitchen table when Mackie came downstairs. She hadn't slept much. He could tell by the way she was sitting, perfectly straight, both hands wrapped around her coffee mug, eyes fixed on something that wasn't in the room. There was a legal pad on the table in front of her. She had filled 3 pages. Dwayne arrived at 8. Ross came 20 minutes after that, still moving carefully because of the bruise on her forearm. They sat around the table and Eleanor looked at each of them in turn, the way she did in court when she was about to say something that needed to land cleanly. "I'm filing for personal leave from the bench," she said. "Effective today. I'm recusing myself from all active cases." The silence was immediate. Mackie set down his mug. Ross opened her mouth and then closed it. Dwayne leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, the way he did when he was running numbers in his head. "Ellie," Ross started. "Let me finish." Eleanor's voice was calm, not cold, calm. There was a difference, and her family knew it. "I am going to file a civil rights lawsuit against Chad Merritt, Raymond Parlin, and every party connected to what happened yesterday. To do that properly, I need to be a plaintiff. And a sitting federal judge cannot be a plaintiff in a case that touches her jurisdiction." She paused. "So, I'm stepping down temporarily. I'm taking off the robe, and I'm fighting this as a private citizen." Another silence. Longer this time. "They would love that," Dwayne said carefully. "Parlin and Stanhope, you giving up your seat?" "I'm not giving it up. I'm setting it down." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "There's a difference. And here's the other thing. If I fight this from behind the bench, I'm protected, institutionally safe. Nobody can touch me. But I'm also limited. I can't be the face of this. I can't stand up in a courtroom and say what happened to us and what it means." She shook her head. "I didn't spend 11 years on that bench to hide behind it the first time someone comes for me personally." Dwayne looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, like a man conceding a point he had already known he was going to lose. Mackie reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Ross picked up her coffee. "Who's the attorney?" "Nathaniel Cross," Eleanor said. Ross raised her eyebrows. Even she knew that name. Nathaniel Cross had an office on Peachtree Street that looked exactly like a man who had been winning impossible cases for 40 years. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk the size of a small country, framed rulings on the wall, Not his degrees, his rulings. The cases he had argued and won, mounted like paintings. He was 62 years old, medium height, with close-cropped silver hair, and the kind of stillness that came from never having anything left to prove. When Eleanor and Dwayne walked in and sat across from him, he didn't offer pleasantries. He just looked at Eleanor with sharp, patient eyes and waited. She laid it all out. The raid, the warrant, the timestamp, Stanhope's name on the shell company, the 7 other incidents Dwayne's team had begun tracing. All of it, clean and precise, the way she would present to a court. Cross listened without interrupting once. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Cross looked down at the notes he had been making and tapped his pen against the pad twice. "You understand what you're doing," he said. It wasn't a question. "I do. You're stepping off the highest ground you have, voluntarily, to fight on open terrain." "Yes." He studied her. "Most people in your position would work the phones quietly. Call in favors. Let the institution handle it from the inside." "The institution didn't stop it from happening," Eleanor said. "I don't see why I should trust it to fix it." Cross was quiet for another moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but the closest thing to one she had seen from him yet. "I've been waiting 20 years, he said, "for a client who actually understands what she's up against." Eleanor looked at him evenly across the wide desk. "Then let's not waste any more time." Cross clicked his pen and turned to a fresh page. 1 week in, the walls started going up. It began with the security footage. Cross called Eleanor on a Tuesday morning, 1 week after she and Mackie had signed the retainer. His voice had that particular flatness it got when he was delivering bad news he had already processed so he could hand it to you clean. "The security server at Magnolia Grove is gone," he said. "Wiped. Whoever did it knew exactly where to look and exactly how to do it. The venue owners noticed it yesterday when their own IT contractor went in to pull the files for us." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Parlin's office? They deny any knowledge." "Naturally." Cross paused. "It gets worse." It did. The Atlanta Police Department's warrant processing unit had conducted an internal audit, conveniently, in the 4 days since Eleanor filed her initial complaint. The result of that audit was that all records related to the expedited approval of the Magnolia Grove warrant had been removed from the filing system. Not misfiled, not archived, removed. The officer who handled the processing was on administrative leave for unrelated reasons and unavailable for comment. Eleanor sat with the phone against her ear and said nothing for 3 full seconds. "They're cleaning house," she said. "Fast," Cross agreed. "Which means they're scared. Scared people make mistakes. We just have to be patient enough to find them." Patient. Eleanor wrote the word on her legal pad and underlined it twice, the way she did with things she needed to remember to feel rather than just know. By Thursday, Stanhope's attorneys had filed 2 separate injunctions. The first blocked Piper O'Hara's federal investigation from accessing the shell company's financial records, citing privacy protections for private business entities. The second challenged the federal jurisdiction of the investigation entirely, arguing that a local police action did not constitute a federal civil rights matter. Both injunctions were well constructed. Both would take time to defeat. Piper called Eleanor that evening from what sounded like a parking garage. Her voice was tight, but controlled. "They've got good lawyers," Piper said. "Stanhope can afford good lawyers," Eleanor said. "Can we beat them?" "Yes, but not quickly." Eleanor looked at the legal pad on her kitchen table. The pages were filling up fast now. Names, dates, connections, Every thread she and Cross and Dwayne were pulling at simultaneously. It looked like progress. It also looked like a net with holes in it. "Keep moving," Eleanor said. Friday brought the cruelest blow of the week. 2 employees of Magnolia Grove Estate had agreed to give statements. Both had been present during the raid. Both had heard Lieutenant Merritt, in the minutes before he spotted Eleanor, make a remark to a fellow officer about, his exact words, as both had reported them independently, "these people and their parties." It was small, but in a civil rights case, small things mattered. Small things were often the difference. Cross called Eleanor on Friday afternoon. Both witnesses had recanted. No explanation. No new information. They had simply contacted Cross's office and withdrawn their statements. One of them had done it through an attorney, a brand new attorney, retained that same week, whose office address was 2 floors below Stanhope's real estate company in a building on Marietta Street. Eleanor didn't say anything when Cross told her. She just wrote both names on her legal pad and circled them. The weekend brought the television. Ross had come over Saturday evening with groceries and the particular energy of a woman who needed to keep her hands busy so she wouldn't say everything on her mind. She was making rice and chicken in Eleanor's kitchen when Mackie turned on the news, and they all went quiet at the same time. Chad Merritt was on cable television in a pressed civilian shirt, sitting across from a sympathetic anchor who was nodding along like he was describing a natural disaster he had heroically survived. Merritt's voice was measured, reasonable. He looked directly into the camera and said that every procedure had been followed correctly, that the tip had been credible, that his officers had acted with complete professionalism, and that it was a shame a routine search was being turned into, his words, a political weapon by someone with enough connections to make the whole country look the wrong way. The anchor nodded again. Ross turned from the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand. "He is unbelievable." "Ross!" Eleanor's voice was quiet. "Don't Ross me. That man is sitting on national television, lying through every single tooth in his—" "Ross!" Ross stopped. She looked at Eleanor. Eleanor was watching Merritt's face on the screen with an expression that was completely, almost unnervingly, calm. "He believes he's untouchable," Eleanor said. She picked up her pen. That's always the first mistake. 2 weeks in, Dwayne walked into Cross's office carrying a folder 2 inches thick. He set it on the conference table without a word. Then he sat down across from Eleanor and Cross and looked at both of them with the expression of a man who had spent the last 14 days hoping he was wrong about something and had just run out of hope. "It's not just us," he said. Cross pulled the folder toward him and opened it. Eleanor leaned in from the other side. For the next 20 minutes, the only sounds in the room were turning pages and the distant noise of Peachtree Street 14 floors below. The first case was a restaurant. Dwayne's team had found it 3 days into their research. A black-owned soul food restaurant called Lena's Table on the southwest side of Atlanta. 18 months ago, it had been raided by the Atlanta Department of Health and the police department simultaneously, responding to an anonymous tip alleging multiple code violations and unsanitary food handling. The raid happened on a Saturday afternoon during the lunch rush. Officers cleared the dining room. Health inspectors went through the kitchen. They found nothing. No violations. No evidence of anything the tip described. 2 weeks later, Lena's Table received a notice from its landlord citing the raid as a breach of conduct under their lease agreement. The restaurant lost the lease. The building was purchased by a property management company 4 months after that. That company was a subsidiary of a larger real estate holding group. That holding group traced back to Victor Stanhope. Dwayne turned to the next tab in the folder without being asked. A church. Greater Emmanuel Baptist on the west side. 11 months ago, 6 officers had entered the church parking lot on a Sunday morning, between the end of the early service and the start of the late one, so both congregations were present, responding to an anonymous tip about illegal weapons being stored on the property. They searched the parking lot, the groundskeeper's shed, and the church van. They found nothing. An 81-year-old deacon had a heart episode during the search and was taken to the hospital. The church's application for an expansion permit, filed 3 months prior, was denied 2 weeks after the raid, citing unresolved community concerns about the property. Greater Emmanuel had been trying to build a community center on the adjacent lot for 4 years. That adjacent lot was currently listed as pending acquisition by a Stanhope Development subsidiary. Eleanor set down the page she was holding. "Keep going," she said. Dwayne kept going. 5 more. A black-owned dry cleaning business whose owner had been handcuffed in front of his customers during a search that produced nothing, and whose commercial lease had tripled in price 60 days later. A family-owned hardware store. A community health clinic operating out of a building that a Stanhope LLC had been trying to purchase for 18 months without success, until an anonymous tip brought officers through the front door on a Wednesday afternoon, and the clinic's operating license came under sudden regulatory review. 7 incidents. 18 months. Every single one of them triggered by an anonymous tip. Every tip traced through a shell company. Every shell company structured identically. Same filing format, same registered agent categories, same deliberately obscured ownership layers, and every targeted property sitting inside a development corridor that Victor Stanhope had been quietly, methodically buying up piece by piece. Eleanor stood up from the table and walked to the window. Below her, Atlanta moved in its ordinary Friday afternoon rhythm. Cars and people, and the whole indifferent machinery of a city going about its business. Somewhere in that city, Victor Stanhope was in an office or a country club or a boardroom, and he believed that all of this was buried, that 7 families had been hurt and scared and driven out, and that nobody had connected the lines between them. He had not counted on Dwayne. She turned back to the table. Cross had not looked up from the folder. He was still reading, slowly and methodically, moving from tab to tab with the focus of a man cataloging ammunition. His pen was moving. His expression was unreadable. Finally, he closed the folder. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up at Eleanor with something in his eyes she had not seen there before. Not just focus. Something closer to awe. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "do you know what you have here?" She held his gaze. "A federal civil rights conspiracy," she said. Cross looked back down at the folder. He placed both hands flat on top of it, like he was keeping it from going somewhere. "We file everything," he said. "Every word, every family, every name." He reached for his pen. All 7 of them. 3 weeks after walking into Cross's office, Eleanor walked into federal court. She wore steel gray. No jewelry except her pearl earrings, the same ones she had worn at the wedding. Mackie had noticed when she put them in that morning, and hadn't said anything, just watched her with that steady, careful look of his. She had caught his eye in the mirror and nodded once, and he had nodded back, and that was enough. Outside the Richard B. Russell Federal Building, 3 cable news trucks were parked along the curb. A small crowd had gathered on the steps. Some supporters, some protesters, some people who had simply read the news and wanted to see what justice looked like when it finally showed up to work. Dwayne walked on Eleanor's left. Cross walked on her right. Ross had wanted to come. Eleanor had asked her to stay home and watch with Mackie. Some things you needed witnesses for. Others you needed to walk into alone. The courtroom filled fast. Journalists took the back rows. In the gallery, Eleanor recognized two staffers from the House Judiciary Committee, sitting quietly with notepads. Piper O'Hara sat 3 rows behind the plaintiff's table in civilian clothes, her federal marshal's composure locked down completely. Across the aisle, Stanhope's legal team was already arranged. 4 attorneys in expensive suits, with a wall of bankers' boxes stacked beside them like a fortress they believed in. Stanhope himself was not present. His lawyers had advised against it, Eleanor assumed. Parlin was not there either. Merritt was. He sat in the gallery in a dark suit with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and when Eleanor walked past him to reach the plaintiff's table, he stared at her with the particular contempt of a man who still believed he was going to win. She didn't look at him. The Honorable Sandra Reeves took the bench at 9 o'clock exactly. 60 years old, sharp-faced, with a reputation for asking the questions nobody wanted to answer. She had been on the federal bench for 18 years and had never once been accused of being predictable. Cross rose and began. He was extraordinary. Eleanor had known he would be. She had seen his record, read his rulings, heard the stories, but watching him work in person was something else entirely. He laid out the civil rights conspiracy case with the patience and precision of a master craftsman. He didn't rush. He didn't perform. He simply built, piece by piece, the complete architecture of what Victor Stanhope and Raymond Parlin had constructed. The fake tips, the shell companies, the raids, the 7 families, the property acquisitions, until the courtroom could see it whole. Judge Reeves listened without expression, but she asked questions, sharp ones. She asked Stanhope's lead attorney to explain the timeline of the expedited warrant approval with a specificity that made the man visibly uncomfortable. She asked about the structural similarities between the 7 shell companies with the focus of someone who had already noticed them herself. When Cross presented Piper's federal findings tracing 2 of the companies directly, Reeves looked at the documents for a long time before setting them down. Stanhope's attorneys objected repeatedly. Reeves sustained some, overruled others, and at one point looked at their lead counsel over her glasses and said, "Counselor, I've read your brief. I'd like you to answer my question." The gallery was very quiet after that. By noon, it was over. Judge Reeves gathered her notes and looked out at the courtroom. She would issue her ruling on advancing to full trial within 48 hours. She said nothing else that could be quoted or analyzed or spun. But her eyes had said enough. In the corridor afterward, Cross allowed himself exactly 1 satisfied exhale. Dwayne was grinning so wide it looked like it might be permanent. Piper O'Hara crossed the corridor and shook Eleanor's hand without a word, which from Piper was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Mackie was on the phone the second Eleanor walked through the door that evening. He made her sit down. He made her eat. And then they went out to the back porch the way they always did when they needed the quiet, and sat side by side in the dark with the Georgia night making its usual sounds around them. Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. After a while, he said, "After all this is done, we're having the most beautiful wedding this city has ever seen." She laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not the careful, composed laugh of a federal judge managing a public moment. A full, open, completely unguarded laugh that came from somewhere deep and real. The first one since the raid. Mackie pulled her closer. For the first time in 3 weeks, Eleanor Harshman let herself believe it was almost over. The call came at 7:43 in the morning. Eleanor was still in her robe, both hands around her coffee mug, watching the light come up over the backyard. She had slept better than she had in weeks. For the first time since the raid, she had gone to bed without her legal pad, without her pen, without the low-grade hum of dread that had been running underneath everything like a broken appliance she had gotten used to hearing. She should have known better. The judge recused herself, Cross said. Eleanor set down her mug. Overnight, Cross continued. Stanhope's team filed a conflict of interest motion at 11 p.m. They argued that Judge Reeves's collegial relationship with you through the federal judiciary constitutes an appearance of bias. The motion is thin. Technically, it shouldn't have cleared, but it did. He paused. She had no choice but to step down. Eleanor stood up slowly from the kitchen table. Who's the replacement? The silence on the other end lasted exactly 1 second too long. Gerald Ferris, Cross said. She knew the name. Every federal attorney in Georgia knew the name. Gerald Ferris was 71 years old, appointed to the federal bench by Governor Dale Hutchins 14 years ago. Governor Hutchins, who had received the single largest private donation of his entire political career, $400,000, from a PAC with Victor Stanhope's fingerprints all over it. Cross was still talking. Eleanor was listening, but part of her mind was already running the math. The angles, the exposure. Ferris moved within the hour. He dismissed 3 of the 5 primary counts on a standing technicality, ruling that 2 of the plaintiffs among the 7 victims lacked sufficient documented connection to the original complaint to maintain their claims at this stage. He ruled 2 of Dwayne's shell company research submissions entirely inadmissible, on the grounds that evidence gathered through a nonprofit advocacy organization did not meet federal evidentiary standards. And he set the new hearing date, 14 weeks out. Eleanor was in Cross's office by 9. She sat in the chair across from his desk and listened to him explain each ruling in precise, measured terms. He was angry. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his pen kept clicking. But he kept his voice level because that was who Nathaniel Cross was. He did not waste energy on reactions he couldn't use. We appeal the evidentiary rulings, he said. We redocument the shell company research through official channels. It takes time, but we rebuild. 14 weeks, Eleanor said. 14 weeks, Cross confirmed. She nodded. She stood up. She thanked him and walked out. The story ran that afternoon. Someone in Parlin's camp had been sitting on it, waiting for the right moment. The headline appeared on a major news outlet's website at 2:15 p.m. Federal judge's wedding venue. Had prior noise complaints. Was tip entirely baseless? The piece was thin and carefully worded. Nothing technically false. Everything deliberately misleading. It cited 2 anonymous sources and a noise complaint filed against the venue from 18 months ago that had been resolved in a single mediation meeting. By 4 o'clock, it had been shared 300,000 times. By 6, 2 cable programs were running segments debating whether the original tip had contained a kernel of legitimate concern. The wedding footage, the video that had moved 30 million people, the video of Eleanor in her ivory gown being handcuffed on the most important day of her life, was suddenly buried under an avalanche of noise. Eleanor watched it happen from her living room and said nothing. Then Mackey's phone rang. He stepped into the kitchen to take it. Eleanor heard his voice change. That particular shift from normal to careful that meant something was wrong. He came back to the doorway, and stood there with the phone in his hand, and an expression she had never seen on him before. Something stripped down, exposed. "The medical board," he said. "I've received notice of an inquiry. Filed anonymously." He looked at her. "They're coming after my practice, Ellie." The room went very still. Mackie sat down at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands. This man, this steady, gentle, unshakable man, sat there with his shoulders curved inward and said quietly, "I love you more than anything in this world, but I need you to tell me, is this going to stop?" Eleanor stood at the kitchen window. Outside, the street was dark and ordinary. Somewhere out there, Victor Stanhope was sleeping just fine. She stared at the dark for a long time. "Yes," she said finally. She turned around. "But not the way they think." Mackie went to bed at 11. Eleanor heard the creak of the stairs, then the sound of water running through the pipes above her. Then silence. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the legal pad in front of her for a long time, without writing anything. The house was completely quiet, except for the refrigerator hum and the occasional car passing outside. She thought about her father. Not the memory she usually carried. The sidewalk, the Sunday suit, the police officer's voice. A different one. She was 12 years old, and she had come home from school with a split lip because a girl twice her size had decided Eleanor's straight-A report card was a personal offense. Her father had sat across from her at this same kind of kitchen table. Different house, same feeling, and cleaned the cut with a damp cloth and said, "Did you fight back?" She had shaken her head. Eleanor picked up her pen. She wrote 3 names on the legal pad, drew a line under each one. Then she picked up her phone and made the first call. The DOJ Civil Rights Division operates out of Wilbert, but the senior field official for the Southeast region kept late hours. Eleanor knew this because she had served alongside him on a federal judicial panel 3 years ago, and learned that Roger Castillo was the kind of man who answered his phone at 11:30 at night without acting like it was unusual. He answered on the second ring. Eleanor did not ask for favors. She did not call in history or relationship or any of the quiet currency that moved through institutional networks. She spoke the way she always spoke in a courtroom, clearly, precisely, without decoration. She laid out the documented pattern, the 7 incidents, the shell companies, the property corridors, the connections between Stanhope's financial network and the Atlanta Police Department's warrant processing unit. She cited dates, filing numbers, and the specific federal statutes she believed had been violated. She was not a plaintiff calling for help. She was a federal officer of the court reporting a documented conspiracy. Those were 2 completely different things, and Roger Castillo understood the difference immediately. "I'll need everything you have in writing," he said. "By morning." "You'll have it by midnight," Eleanor said. She hung up and started writing. The second call went to the editor of a national investigative journalism outlet whose work Eleanor had admired for 20 years. She did not provide evidence. She was careful about that, meticulous, the way she was about everything. What she provided was a roadmap, a series of questions whose answers, if pursued by a reporter with the right access and the right determination, would lead somewhere significant. The editor listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, the editor said, "How long have you been sitting on this?" "I've been building it," Eleanor said. "There's a difference. How long do I have?" "However long it takes to do it right." 2 weeks, the editor said. "Maybe less." Eleanor wrote the timeline on her legal pad and circled it. The third call was the quietest. She dialed Judge Gerald Ferris at 11:58. He answered after 4 rings, his voice thick with sleep, and then suddenly alert when he heard who was calling. Eleanor could picture him sitting up in the dark, reaching for a lamp. She was not hostile. She was not threatening. She was, if anything, impeccably courteous. The way you were courteous with a colleague when you needed them to understand something clearly and completely. She informed him that she had filed a formal complaint that afternoon with the Federal Judicial Council. The complaint documented the timeline of his rulings in her case alongside the public financial records connecting Governor Hutchins's PAC, the one funded significantly by Stanhope's network, to Ferris's original appointment. She was not accusing him of anything, she said. She was simply noting that the complaint was now a matter of official record. "I thought you'd want to know before it became public," she said. Professional courtesy. Ferris said nothing for a long moment. "Good night, Judge," Eleanor said. She hung up. She sat back in her chair and looked at the legal pad. 3 names, 3 lines. She drew a check beside each one, closed the pad, and turned off the kitchen light. Cross called at 7:15 the next morning. Eleanor was already dressed, already at the table. Coffee made, legal pad open, pen in hand. Ferris recused himself, Cross said. His voice carried something it hadn't held in weeks. A current of energy running just beneath the surface, controlled but unmistakable. Eleanor exhaled slowly through her nose. "Good," she said. "Eleanor." Cross paused. "What did you do last night?" She looked out the kitchen window at the morning coming up pale and clean over the backyard. "I fought smart," she said. The subpoenas landed on a Wednesday, not one at a time, not quietly, through the mail, with the polite fiction that everyone involved had time to prepare. They arrived simultaneously. Piper O'Hara's team had coordinated the delivery with the kind of precision that only federal resources could produce. Hitting Parlin's department, Stanhope's financial records office, the registered agents for all 7 shell companies, and the Atlanta Police Department's warrant processing unit within the same 40-minute window. By 9 in the morning, 4 different attorneys had called Nathaniel Cross's office to complain. Cross didn't return a single one of those calls. Piper ran the operation from a federal field office on the north side of Atlanta. Eleanor had spoken to her briefly the night before, a 5-minute call, efficient and focused. And Piper had said only what she needed to say. "We have everything we need to move. Give me 72 hours." She had not needed 72 hours. Her team had been building quietly for 3 weeks, working the financial architecture of Stanhope's shell company network with the patience of people who understood that the goal was not to find something. It was to find everything. Every transfer, every filing, every corporate layer carefully constructed to put distance between Victor Stanhope's name and the damage his money caused. What broke the case open was not a document. It was a phone. One of Stanhope's deputies, a man named Gabby Pruitt, who had worked as his operations manager for 11 years, had made the mistake that careful people always eventually make. He had used his personal phone for 2 conversations he should have made disappear. The messages had been deleted. Piper's digital forensics team recovered them anyway, the way federal digital forensics teams always did, pulling the data back from the spaces where deleted things went to hide. The first message was from Pruitt to a senior officer in Parlin's warrant processing unit. It was sent 4 days before the Magnolia Grove raid. It read, "The Harshman situation needs to be addressed before she comes back from leave and starts making noise about the corridor properties. Parlin knows what to do. Make sure the paperwork moves fast." The second message was the reply. 3 words. "Consider it done." Piper called Eleanor at noon. Eleanor was sitting at Cross's conference table when the call came in. She put it on speaker without asking permission, because Cross was already leaning forward in his chair, with both hands flat on the table. Piper read both messages aloud. The conference room was completely silent when she finished. Cross stood up slowly, the way tall buildings rise, with absolute certainty about their own weight. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to the room. "We refiled today," he said. The refiled complaint landed in federal court that afternoon. The full case, rebuilt and expanded. All 7 victims. All 7 incidents. The complete shell company network. The property acquisition timeline. The warrant processing communications. And Piper's recovered messages connecting Pruitt to Parlin's department in language so direct it left no room for interpretation. The new presiding judge was the Honorable Vera Martin, 54 years old, appointed 11 years ago. No political debts that anyone had been able to find, because nobody had tried to put any there. She had a civil rights record that Cross knew cold. He had appeared before her twice, and won both times, and what he remembered most was that she read everything herself and asked questions that proved it. Judge Martin read the refiled complaint that evening. She scheduled the hearing for 10 days out. The investigative piece published the next morning at 6 a.m. 43 pages, 11 sources, 18 months of documented incidents, all laid out with the methodical clarity of reporters who had spent 2 weeks doing exactly what Eleanor had pointed them toward. The piece named names. It showed the shell company structures with diagrams. It mapped the property corridors. It put the Magnolia Grove wedding raid in the center of the story the moment the pattern became visible, but made clear it was one entry in a long, deliberate ledger. At 6:15, it was the most read article on the outlet's website. By 9, 3 national networks had picked it up. By noon, 12 million people had read it. Stanhope's lawyers stopped returning Cross's calls at 12:30. Parlin did not leave his office all day. His press secretary issued a statement describing the investigation as politically motivated. Nobody ran it. Eleanor read the piece at her kitchen table that morning, all 43 pages, beginning to end without stopping. When she finished, she closed the laptop and sat quietly for a moment. Mackie came in and looked at her face. "Is it good?" he asked. Eleanor looked up at him. "It's everything," she said. 10 days later, Eleanor walked into federal court for the second time. The difference was immediate and physical. The first hearing had been packed. This one was something else entirely. Every seat in the gallery was filled before 8:30 in the morning. People were standing along the back wall. 2 sketch artists sat in the second row, because cameras weren't permitted, and the networks wanted something to show. The congressional staffers were back, more of them this time, 4 instead of 2, and one of them Eleanor recognized as a senior counsel for the House Judiciary Committee. She walked to the plaintiff's table and sat down and did not look at the gallery. Merritt was there again. Same dark suit, same crossed arms, but something had changed in his face since the last hearing. The contempt was still there, but underneath it now was something tighter. Something that looked, if you knew what to look for, like a man who had started doing the math and didn't like the answer. Stanhope's 4 attorneys were at the defense table. The bankers' boxes were gone. In their place were 2 slim folders and 4 expressions that had been carefully arranged to project confidence. Eleanor had been in enough courtrooms to know the difference between confidence and its performance. Judge Vera Martin took the bench at 9 o'clock. Cross was on his feet within minutes. He began with the 7 families. Not with the legal framework or the statutory citations, those would come, but with the people. Lena's table, Greater Emmanuel Baptist, the hardware store, the health clinic. He described what had happened to each of them in plain, specific language, the kind that didn't require a law degree to understand. The dining room cleared mid-lunch. The congregation searched between services. The deacon taken away in an ambulance. He named every business owner, every family, every loss. The courtroom was completely still. Then he built the architecture. The shell companies, the financial trails, the property corridors, the recovered messages between Pruitt and Parlin's department. He laid it all out with the patience of a man who had been doing this for 40 years and understood that the most powerful thing a lawyer could do in a courtroom was make the truth impossible to look away from. Judge Martin listened to every word. When Cross finished the opening presentation, she turned to the defense table and asked Stanhope's lead attorney to explain the structural similarities between the 7 shell companies. The attorney began a prepared answer about standard corporate filing practices. Martin cut him off in the 3rd sentence. "Counselor," she said, "I've read the filings. I'm asking you to explain the similarities, not describe standard practice." The attorney regrouped and tried again. Martin listened, asked 2 more questions, and moved on. Merritt was called to testify at 11. He walked to the stand the same way he walked everywhere, like he owned the floor under his feet. Cross let him settle. Let him answer the first 3 questions with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who had been rehearsed carefully by people who charged $400 an hour. Then Cross produced the warrant processing timeline. He walked Merritt through it minute by minute. Who requested the expedited approval? Who processed it? Who signed off? Merritt's answers grew shorter, more careful. Cross kept walking forward, and Merritt kept stepping back until he reached the wall and said the thing that finished him. "I was following orders," Merritt said. "The warrant came through proper channels. I executed the search as directed. That's all." The courtroom absorbed this in silence. Someone in the gallery made a sound. Not a word, just an exhale of recognition that moved through the room like a wave. Judge Martin's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened by 1 degree. Just following orders. In a civil rights case. In a federal courtroom. Cross did not react to it visibly. He simply marked it in his notes and moved on, because he didn't need to underline it. Everyone in the room had already done that themselves. Stanhope took the stand at 2 in the afternoon. He was dressed perfectly. Silver-haired, straight-backed, projecting the particular authority of a man who had spent 60 years being told he was important. His attorneys had prepared him for 3 days. He began well, measured, precise, every answer shaped to acknowledge nothing. Cross let him talk. He waited until Stanhope had established his rhythm, found his comfort, started to believe the room was manageable. Then Cross placed the recovered messages on the podium and began. He asked about Pruitt. Stanhope said he recalled general conversations. He asked about the corridor properties. Stanhope said he had many investments. He asked about the timing of the Magnolia Grove tip. Stanhope said he had no knowledge of any tip. Cross asked the same question 4 different ways across 11 minutes. Each time the answer came back, "I don't recall." Then Cross placed a specific message on the screen. Pruitt's text, the one that said, "The Harshman situation needs to be addressed," and asked Stanhope directly whether he had instructed Pruitt to contact Parlin's department regarding Eleanor Harshman. Stanhope looked at his attorneys. He looked at the message. He said, "I don't recall that conversation." The courtroom went very quiet. Judge Martin leaned forward. "Mr. Stanhope," she said. Her voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "I want to remind you that you are under oath." Victor Stanhope sat in the witness chair and said nothing. The room held its breath. 3 days after the hearing, Cross called at 9 in the morning. Mackie was in the kitchen when Eleanor's phone rang. He watched her face as she answered. The stillness of it, the way she held herself when something important was happening. He had learned to read her in 6 years, the way you learn to read weather. The small signals, the things she didn't know she was showing. He saw the moment it changed. It started around her eyes. Something released there. Some tension that had been living in the corners of them for so long, he had almost forgotten it wasn't permanent. Then her jaw loosened. Then she exhaled, slow and deep, the way a person exhales when they have been holding something very heavy, and someone has finally said, they can put it down. She looked at him across the kitchen. She nodded once. Mackie sat down in the nearest chair. Judge Vera Martin had taken 3 days, and she had used every hour of them. The ruling was 41 pages long. Cross read the operative sections to Eleanor over the phone in the careful, precise voice he used when the words mattered too much to rush. Chief Raymond Parlin. Liable. Civil rights violations under Section 1983. Racially discriminatory use of police power. Retaliatory conduct against a federal officer of the court. The ruling was direct and unsparing. Martin had not softened a single finding. Parlin was ordered to pay $1.2 million in damages. The ruling further recommended his conduct be referred to the Georgia Attorney General's office for review of potential criminal exposure. Cross had barely finished the sentence before Eleanor's phone lit up with a news alert. Parlin had submitted his resignation to the mayor's office at 9:47 that morning. Effective immediately. His statement was 4 sentences long and contained no apology. By afternoon, the mayor had accepted it in a press release that was 2 sentences longer and contained considerably more regret. Most of it, Eleanor suspected, about the timing. Raymond Parlin would never hold public office again. Lieutenant Chad Merritt. Terminated. Effective the date of the ruling. His law enforcement certification referred to the Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council for review and likely revocation. A separate criminal referral filed with the Fulton County District Attorney's Office for filing false incident reports and making material misrepresentations in a sworn warrant application. Cross read this section and then paused. "He's done," Cross said simply. "Professionally and likely criminally. His attorney called my office an hour ago asking about a cooperation agreement." Eleanor said nothing for a moment. "Tell them to call the DA," she said. Victor Stanhope. This section took longer to read. Civil damages of $4.7 million to Eleanor and Mackie for violation of civil rights, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and conspiracy to weaponize law enforcement for private financial gain. An additional $2.3 million to be distributed among the 7 other victims of the Shell Company scheme, allocated proportionally based on documented losses. A DOJ criminal referral for conspiracy to violate civil rights, wire fraud across state lines, and obstruction of justice. An immediate freeze, pending full federal investigation on all of Stanhope's active development permits across 3 Atlanta neighborhoods. His real estate holding companies named as subjects of a continuing federal inquiry. Cross finished reading and let the silence sit for a moment. "His attorneys called this morning, too," Cross said. before the ruling was even public. What did they want? To talk about settlement. Tell them we already have one, Eleanor said. There was one more thing. Eleanor had asked Cross for it 3 days ago, before the ruling, when they were reviewing the final filings. He had looked at her when she asked and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Of course." At the public reading of the ruling that afternoon, before the gallery and the cameras and the congressional staffers and the journalists who had covered every hour of this story, Nathaniel Cross stood at the plaintiff's table and read 7 names into the federal court record. Lena's Table, Greater Emmanuel Baptist, the hardware store, the health clinic, all 7 families, all 7 businesses. Every single one, read aloud, slowly and clearly, so that each name landed and settled and became part of the permanent record of what had been done and what it had cost. The gallery was completely silent throughout. That evening, Eleanor and Mackie sat on the back porch in the dark. No phones, no television, no legal pads. Just the Georgia night and the sound of the neighborhood settling into itself and the warmth of 2 people sitting close after a very long time in the cold. Mackie took her hand. Neither of them spoke for a while. The stars were out. Eleanor looked up at them and thought about her father in his Sunday suit, and the sidewalk, and the promise he had made her when she was 7 years old. "One day, baby, you will." She squeezed Mackie's hand. "Let's get married," she said. Mackie turned to look at her. Then he smiled, wide and slow and completely unguarded. The smile of a man who had been waiting a long time to hear exactly those words. "Yeah," he said. "Let's." 6 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in early October, Eleanor Harshman stood in front of a mirror again. Same bridal suite. Same ivory silk gown, cleaned and pressed and hanging without a single trace of what it had been through. Same pearl earrings. A new veil, slightly longer than the first one, with delicate embroidered edges that caught the light when she moved. The venue owners had refused every dollar of the settlement money. Instead, they had spent their own, quietly and without announcement, making Magnolia Grove more beautiful than it had ever been. New flower arrangements on every post. Fresh paint on the garden gate. The flagstones where the wedding cake had shattered were gone, replaced with smooth, pale stone that looked like it had always been there. Some things you didn't patch. You replaced them with something better. Ross stood behind Eleanor with both hands raised, working the veil into place with the focused precision of a woman who had been waiting 6 weeks to do exactly this. She was wearing the same bridesmaid dress. She had ironed it herself that morning at 5 a.m. Eleanor had heard her doing it from upstairs and hadn't said a word. The bridesmaids were all there, every one of them. The federal prosecutor was already crying and trying to hide it behind her champagne glass. The congresswoman was giving a running commentary on the flower arrangements that nobody had asked for and everyone was grateful for. The Supreme Court clerk was laughing at something on her phone and then showing it to the prosecutor, which made the crying worse. Eleanor watched them in the mirror and felt something so full and complete she didn't have a word for it. "Hold still," Ross said. "I'm not moving. You're breathing too loud." Eleanor laughed. Ross stepped around to face her. She held Eleanor by both shoulders the same way she had 6 weeks ago, looking at every version of her at once, the way only a person who had been there for all of them could. Her eyes were bright. Her jaw was set in the particular way it got when she was refusing to cry in front of people. She was absolutely going to cry in front of people. "Mama would have loved this dress," she said. Same words as last time. "You said that last time," Eleanor told her. "It was true last time." Ross straightened the veil one final millimeter. "It's still true." She stepped back and looked at her sister. Really looked. And then she said something she hadn't said 6 weeks ago. "Daddy would have loved today," she said quietly. The room got very still. Eleanor held her sister's gaze. She thought about a Sunday morning and a blue suit and a sidewalk and a promise made at the edge of a little girl's bed. She thought about 11 years on the federal bench and everything it had cost to get there, and everything it had cost to step away from it and fight in the open where anyone could see her. She thought about 7 families whose names were now part of the permanent federal record. She smiled. Not the composed, careful smile she kept ready for courtrooms and cameras. The real one. The wide-open, completely unguarded smile of a woman who had been told she would win and had never stopped believing it. "He knew I would," she said. Outside, the string quartet began. 140 guests had come back. Every single one. Plus 30 more who had called the venue coordinator and asked carefully and hopefully whether there might be room. There was room. There was always going to be room for people who showed up. Mackie stood at the altar. His eyes found the door of the bridal suite before Eleanor even appeared, the way they always did, like he had a compass that only pointed one direction. His groomsmen flanked him, the same 4 men who had been forced face down on the grass in their tuxedos 6 weeks ago. They stood straighter today, shoulders back, chins up, the particular pride of men who had been pushed down and chosen to rise, and knew the difference between the two. Eleanor stepped out of the suite. The garden went quiet in that way gardens do when something true is happening in them. She walked 40 feet, the same 40 feet, the same Georgia light coming down warm and golden through the magnolia trees, the same white roses on the aisle posts, the same music lifting up into the October air. No sirens came up the drive. No gates burst open. Nobody put their hands on anyone. She reached Mackie, and he took her hands in both of his, and his eyes were full, and she didn't look away from them for a single second. The ceremony was simple and perfect and entirely theirs. At the reception, Eleanor stood to speak. The room went quiet immediately, the instinctive quiet of people who understood they were about to hear something worth hearing. She thanked her guests. She thanked Mackie, who looked at her from his chair like she was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. She thanked Ross, who was already dabbing her eyes with a cocktail napkin. She thanked Dwayne, Cross, Piper. She said their names clearly and let each one land. Then she paused. "My father told me something when I was 7 years old," she said. "He said one day I would win." She looked out at the faces in front of her. All of them. Everyone. "I spent a long time thinking winning meant the title, the robe, the gavel, the institutional protection of a system that was supposed to work for everyone." She shook her head slowly. "But the real win, the one that lasts, isn't the power they give you. It's the justice you fight for when they take it away." The room was absolutely still. Eleanor raised her glass. "To everybody who ever got knocked down in their best clothes." Her voice was steady and clear and carried to every corner of the garden. "Get back up. Your day is coming." 170 people rose to their feet. Dwayne made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob that was entirely his sister's victory and entirely his own pride and entirely the sound of a promise, made long ago on the edge of a little girl's bed, finally and completely kept. The Georgia night came down warm around all of them. Nobody left early. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.